Moving on to item number 17, we have a draft agreement in principle with the Department of Water Resources for water management in California, water fix that will result in future amendments to the city-state water project water supply contract. We have Diana. That was long.
That was very long. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm here tonight with Greg Young of Tulane Young, a water planning firm, to discuss this draft agreement in principle. I'm sorry to see that a lot of people left because I'm really excited about this item. I feel like this is huge for Yuba City in terms of addressing our role in water fix. So for brief background, the Department of Water Resources administers long-term water supply contracts to 29 water agencies known as state water contractors or public water agencies for water service from the State Water Project. Yuba City is one of 5 of the state water contractors located north of the Delta. And the city contract was executed in 1963 to purchase water, approximately 9,600 acre-feet of surface water via the Feather River on an annual basis. And so as this process started, negotiations started a few years ago and then stopped and then started up again towards the latter part of last year. And so we contacted Greg to act as the negotiator on behalf of the city through this process. And so Greg will be going through the remainder of the slides, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor, Council members. Thank you, Diana. So the part of the reason for having me play the facilitator role is they were having weekly meetings in Sacramento that lasted 5 to 6 hours, and we needed to make sure the city was represented. So instead of pulling Diana away from her other jobs up here, I was able to sit there and participate and make sure the city was well represented. Let's see, make sure I'm using this the right direction. So a couple of the drivers for drafting these agreements in principle was there was a desire for improved, sorry, I realize I can see that right here instead of turning my head. Ongoing water management challenges. During the last drought, there was a lot of attempts to try and move state water project allocation around, especially south of the Delta, and there are limits that DWR placed on those contractors, and so there was a lot of frustration that came out of the 2014, 2015, 2016 period with being able to move around state water project, and so a lot of the PWAs were very anxious to get improvements in that area. Then there's also the overarching potential pending approval of California Water Fix, which has pretty significant financial needs. You've probably read about it in the paper here and there, with several of especially the Southern California interest and Bay Area interest agreeing to take on significant financial obligations. Obviously, a concern to the northern area would be, are we going to be responsible for paying any of that as part of the North of Delta contractors? So the water fix essentially is looking at ways to try and improve the reliability of the state water contract allocation. As Diana noted, you have a contract for about 9,600 acre feet annually. The allocation that is made is based on hydrology and water available in Lake Oroville and other, and also water that's able to move into San Luis Reservoir. So that's part of the water supplies that are determined to make the allocation, including the city's allocation, on an annual basis. Water Fix is intended to improve the delivery of water on a reliable basis by allowing them to shift diversion locations from areas in Sacramento versus areas down by Tracy. And so right now there's a lot of restrictions for pumping down on Tracy, so there's inability to move the water as reliably as they'd like for the water that's stored in Oroville. We can spend days on that topic. I'm sure no one wants to. So the process for the agreement in principle was started out, as I noted, weekly meetings, negotiations. These were public negotiation sessions between DWR and the PWAs. And the reason that they were public was because out of the what was termed the Monterey Agreement a few decades ago, there were lawsuits that came out of that said those were behind door deals that were made. You can't make any changes to contracts without it being in a public process. The result of that was these discussions about water management improvements and funding of Water Fix was made in a public negotiating session. So DWR essentially was one side, The water agencies, the other side. They began in February. There was, like I said, sessions just about every week, and the last session was the end of June. The result was this agreement in principle document that is attached to the staff report. There were also many what I would call PWA caucus meetings where we would break. DWR would go their way, we'd go our way. We'd have an hour-long conversation on a lot of issues, and we'd get back together, have some discussions, break again. It was very interesting because there were several things that people did not want to bring up publicly at that point. So there was a lot of back and forth. There were some small work group sessions that didn't have to be public. There were a lot of phone calls, conference calls, emails, etc. So it was a fairly involved process, again, with the intent for the cities to make sure we weren't going to be funding the water fix. The current draft agreement in principle is independent right now from the contract extension amendment process, which, have you brought that before the council? So there's also a process to extend the contracts that right now expire in 2035 out for another 30 years, I believe, and that allows them to refinance to actually save money. It's kind of similar to the discussions on the wastewater bond funding. That is a process that's been ongoing for several years. This is a separate process, but there is a chance that these two do merge. But right now it is currently an independent process from that contract extension. The objectives under this particular effort from the Department of Water Resources perspective was to allow for the continued financially sound operations of the State Water Project. If they're going to build the new facilities for the water fix at the tune of billions of dollars, they wanted to make sure that they were going to be able to be financing that and be able to continue to pay for it. They also wanted to make sure there was a fair and equitable approach to funding those costs. The water agencies had the objectives of getting enhanced management tools, so more flexibility with being able to transfer and share and exchange state water allocations, and then also appropriately allocate the California Water Fix, that's the CWF, costs proportionate to the benefits received. So the AIP addresses several key topics: the improved water management tool side of things, water transfers, water exchanges, and the ability to actually carry over water a little differently in San Luis Reservoir, including the opportunity to transfer or sell carryover water periodically, is now being, probably is going to be allowed. That's what's in the AIP language. That actually creates some interesting opportunities for the city into the future to consider when it's looking at all of its water assets, its water rights, its contracts with North Yuba, its groundwater sources, and its state water project water. There may be opportunities that these improved management tools are actually beneficial to the city, but that wasn't a main driver for the city's participation. Cost allocation was the other key topic. The result of this was to create a new state water project charge. The city, just like every contractor, gets a bill of service, a charge annually that talks about how you pay for the conservation facilities, which includes repayment for San Luis Reservoir and some of the facilities that get water to San Luis Reservoir, because part of your yield is associated with both Oroville and San Luis and various reaches of the canals in between, and pumping out of the South Delta, and everything gets wrapped into all of these current charges, and they wanted to separate out and create a new charge, and there was a lot of discussion to create that, but the result is there is going to be a new standalone charge that will be assessed. The greatest part about that is there's a table in the attachment to the staff report that demonstrates that the 5 north of Delta public water agencies, so the city, Butte County, Plumas County Flood Control, Solano County Water Agency, and Napa County Flood Control, are all listed as exempt from being charged under this new charge. And that's what our goal was to make sure we ended up exempt. There were times where the table had percentages where it was 0 for right now, but percentages can change. So the term exempt was actually a key term to make sure we got held in there. Going forward, the AIP is not final contract language. This is advisory language that will be informing the CEQA process. And it defines mutual intent. And as quoting from part of the principles here, they do not represent a contractual commitment by either the DWR or PWAs to approve any proposed project or to sign contract amendments. What does that really mean? There is a CEQA process that will go on related to the contract amendments that will come before you at some point in the future that should be completely guided and follow this agreement in principle. You as the city and as a contractor will be able to review and hopefully adopt, if it makes sense, that the findings of that CEQA, and the result will then turn into contract amendments. So then after CEQA process, then there will be a separate contract amendment that will be specific to the city's contract that will be brought forward that both you and the Department of Water Resources will sign. So there's several steps still to go on this, but the AIP was the key to make sure things were understood of how it will now translate into contract language and be represented in CEQA. You want to take the recommendation part? So the recommendation is to authorize the mayor on behalf of the city council to approve the draft agreement in principle for the State Water Project Water Supply Contract Amendment for Water Management and California Water Fix. And happy to entertain any questions that you have.
Great, thank you. Bring it back to council for any questions, comments.
Thank you very much for your work on behalf of the city, making sure that our water rights that we have entered into have been looked after. So I do have a couple of questions on the exempt status. Having been here during the lawsuit phase in which we had to sue DWR for the north of the Delta exemptions to date through the 2035 contract. Is that exempt status to be carried in perpetuity?
Yes, that's the intent. Obviously, as I noted, there's a few more steps here. The plan would be that the new charge that gets developed for the California Water Fix, and it will be called the California Water Fix Facilities Charge, will not show up on your bill ever because of this exempt notation here. So you will never receive that as a charge. That should show up then in contract language as an amendment to your specific contract at some point that you will be signing.
But the payment that we would be making would be if we were to sell stored water out of San Luis, then there would be a fee that would be attached to that if the city were to engage in a sale plan?
No, the only time you would take on any charges for Cal Water Fix is if you were to permanently secure somebody else's, one of the other 28 contractors, Table A allocation. So let's say you wanted to contract with Metropolitan Water District for another 5,000 acre feet of their Table A, and you are going to move it up here. Well, they have agreed to an obligation for that amount. You're now transferring that obligation with that Table A allocation.
So the market is still everything south of Delta then, through that process.
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
So if we were to take an allocation from Napa or Solano, because they have an exempt status also, then...
If you were to take a permanent purchase of their Table A allocation from one of the other 5 north of Delta, yes, there would be there would be no cost that would go with that.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of clarify that because it's through the process, the lawsuit that was settled years ago, not all that long ago, I guess, set some pretty some very good conditions for Yuba City into the future, and I just wanted to make sure that those weren't being amended or challenged through this process.
We actually, those were some of the discussions we did have, is to make sure we understood that the unique situation that came out of the lawsuit for the 5 north of Delta, as far as allocations and costs, were going to be preserved. Specifically, you and Solano and Napa have one set of allocation principles and agreement, and then Plumas and Butte have separate agreements that are a little different. And so we had to work through and make sure all those were maintained.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments? Any action?
The mayor moved to approve staff's recommendation.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? We're on slow mode on that one.
Yeah, that's